Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook and I'm the solicitor at Broudie Canter with day-to-day responsibility for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I'm here with my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of the group having lost her husband to COVID. Joining us today to discuss the evidence heard this week are two guests, both of whom gave evidence this week. Firstly is Dr. Saleyha Ahsan from COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, and secondly, Martina Ferguson, who is the co-lead of Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. Thank you both for joining us today, but more importantly, thank you for the evidence that you gave this week on behalf of each of your groups. I know it wasn't easy, but your testimony was so important and needed to be heard. So on behalf of all those both of our groups represent, thank you.
And I co-sign that, and we're so glad to have you both here. Very much want to talk about your evidence. Before then, I wonder if we could just quickly move back to the end of last week, where we talked about Matt Hancock in the last podcast, and he appeared for a second day testimony, or a half day, and I just quickly wanted to touch on that. The thing I noticed about it was I was astonished at the lack of coverage on the second day. The press pen was empty, and I don't know why this is. There were some political actions the day before. This is photogenic, and the press were there. And the second day, nothing. And yet he gave important testimony, I thought, on this second day. And I don't know what this is. Is it because were they only there because of the actions? Is his celebrity value going down? I don't know. I'd like to just throw it out there and why you think there was not the coverage that there had been on day one. Nicola, can I ask you first?
It's difficult to know, really. I think the coverage of the inquiry as a whole has depleted, unfortunately. And that's really concerning because you see people around you who think this is over. And for many people it is, but for many others it isn't. COVID is still a risk. For anyone clinically vulnerable, it's a very, very real risk. No one really talks about the risk of long COVID. And I think that's a big part of why the coverage isn't there. But also, I think because Matt Hancock hasn't been in position for so long, and no one really knows what he's doing now. Obviously, he's done his stint in the jungle. He's done his stint on Celebrity SAS. I assume he's gearing up for Strictly Come Dancing, but no one really knows what he is actually doing. What's his role now? And so I guess maybe what he says, people don't consider it to have that level of importance that perhaps it once had. But it is still important because he's talking about what he did or didn't do at the time and the reasons why. And that is really key to understanding how we improve in future. So I think it does deserve coverage.
I think you're right, and he's likely to appear in every module, if I'm not mistaken, because he was involved in almost everything. So I think it is important that the press coverage comes. I just had one little anecdote about that, and then I'd like to ask Saleyha her opinion about his testimony. But it was on that second day when there were 5 of us from the COVID memorial wall who liked to say goodbye to him, holding up pictures of our loved ones. And we were pushed back by security to the barrier. He had lines of security, men in high-vis jackets, police, and we were told he won't leave until you move back. And I thought, we're 5 people, mostly over 60. And again, it's this thing of all the protection that the politicians get when it was our loved ones who needed protecting from him. In my view, that is my view. That's my personal anecdote. Saleyha, you heard both days of his testimony, I'm sure. You're a doctor. I'm sure you can give us a special angle on this.
Well, I didn't, to be honest, because I thought, well, preparing for my own day, and also um, Matt Hancock sort of has a habit of inflating my blood pressure, and I wanted to get into the right frame of mind for my own day and not have him or his presence or his day and a half versus my 1 hour of the inquiry to be sort of infected by him and what he would be saying. And frankly, I think we've heard it all before. I think he has actually now become a figure of ridicule, because I believe the joke was based on what he was saying, that, that Matt Hancock had done everything. He'd come into hospitals in the dead of night to distribute masks, open heart surgery. I think it was said that he was, doing at one point, flying around in helicopters doing pre-hospital care. What was it that Matt Hancock hadn't done during the COVID inquiry? I think that was, I'm clearly not stating fact, but I'm only stating what everyone else was saying about him and his day and a half. So whatever he said for his day and a half, of yet again talking about his work and his saviour complex during the COVID period, I think has now become a point of, as I said, ridicule and jokes.
I agree with everything you say, Saleyha. Then this week we had Sajid Javid, the former Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in the UK, take the stand. I'll come to Nicola again first about this. The one thing I noticed was this big long silence. There were two things that stood out for me. One was the big long silence when he was asked if he thought overwhelm was an appropriate word. This has been a theme, I think, during this module. They're like, we were never overwhelmed. And after the end of this long silence, I believe he just again stressed perhaps it wasn't on his watch. And the second thing was, when he was pressed a little bit about how healthcare workers were overworked, he sort of tetchily replied, sometimes people have to cancel their vacations in a national emergency. And I think we all remember when the prime minister himself didn't cancel his vacations. And so I thought that was a bit rich. Nicola, can I come to you first with your thoughts about his testimony?
Yeah, he was quite calm, quite considered in his approach. Just to pick up on what you said about Matt Hancock and when he was leaving and the security, as a counterpoint to that, Sajid Javid just popped out and walked past everyone by himself without anyone around. And even the staff from the venue were like, what a comparison with the witness the day before. They didn't name names, but we all knew they were referring to Matt Hancock. But yeah, back to the evidence of Sajid Javid. The last few weeks we've had this, previously witnesses were asked, was the NHS overwhelmed? And they all said no. The last few weeks when we've had the ministers being called, there's been this shift in that they say, no, it wasn't overwhelmed, but then giving an explanation of what overwhelm actually means to them. And if you change the definition of a word, then it's very easy to use in whatever way, and you can't get pulled up about it. So he said NHS overwhelm to him would mean that the NHS would be unable to cope with emergency cases. A&E would effectively close, ambulances not being able to arrive and drop people off in any kind of reasonable time. Well, we have that. We've heard the stories of the ambulances backed up outside A&E, waiting for hours, being unable to drop off their patients because there's no space in the A&E for them to go. And that's why people were at home waiting for hours for the ambulances to arrive. It wasn't that the ambulance service had taken a day off. It's because they were all lined up outside A&E with patients in their ambulances that they couldn't offload into A&E. So he's basically said the NHS was overwhelmed without saying it.
Yes, I agree. It's been horrible to hear that, I'm sure, especially for health workers. And I think the contrast of those two witnesses on the Friday and the Monday contrasted sharply with Tuesday's evidence, which is the evidence of the COVID bereaved, one from each of the four nations. And we're lucky, you know, to have Martina and Saleyha here. And I have to say, I was in the hearing room and it was just incredibly powerful to hear it. First of all, we had Anna Louise Marsh-Rees from Wales, who gave, I thought, really, really powerful. And she's a very organized, right? She's a very organized mind. And it was very precise. And I understood, I have to say, from her testimony, all of a sudden, I understood more about the situation in Wales than I have than from other witnesses in this entire module. She was really clear. And then we had Margaret Waterton from Scottish COVID bereaved. And she gave a shout out to the COVID memorial wall. And she said something that really struck me. She said, we understand what it is to be bereaved by COVID. For the majority of the world, the rest of the world, COVID is forgotten. And this is reflecting back on what you said, Nicola, what we talked about publicity. It's like, for us, it will never be forgotten. And after her, of course, we had representative from our group. We had Saleyha, and who's also, you're the leader of the healthcare worker subgroup, I believe, aren't you, Saleyha?
Yep.
In our group. So I'd really like to hear from you what that experience was like.
So I think, I mean, it was an important moment, and it felt really strange to be there, to be honest, because when we began preparing for COVID, working within the NHS, within my own department, working within healthcare settings. I'm an emergency medicine doctor by background. I just, you know, if you'd asked me to sort of look ahead and look forward, I never would have imagined that I'd be standing in an inquiry room in front of a judge and talking about people who had lost loved ones at the scale that we had, and then obviously about my own father. But what I found that was important was having the time and the space to do it, because reflecting back, I just remember, as so many other of my colleagues did, that something doesn't add up, something's not right, something's absolutely horrendously wrong, and we're going to be facing we're going to be facing huge deaths and a bit of a disaster. And why is this happening? So to be able to have this day was really important. I hope I did it justice for the group. I was quite, I think for me, in my preparation, I wanted to speak about the group, about mentioning the people who had lost loved ones. So I chose to speak about my father last, because I wanted to make sure that everyone else got heard, even though they weren't able to speak for themselves. And that's another thing that has troubled me about this, and the fact that so few of the bereaved are able to speak, and that I felt the responsibility of going through the statement and making sure that for the group, and making sure that I mentioned as many of the statements relating to people in that statement as much as possible. I hope I covered everyone as much as I could. And if anyone wasn't in there that I was able to bring out, it was merely because of time and the way that the questions were going. It was quick fire, I think. And then in the end, I spoke about my father, but I hope that by speaking about my father's case, what I was trying to do was to reflect wider what was happening to others. I think I found it difficult to stand there and focus on myself when there are so many others. And so that's what my aim and objective was to bring in, just to be the conduit to make sure that at least the stories of others were heard, which I hope, will even persuade them that actually we need to hear from these people for themselves. That's what I was hoping to achieve.
And I think you achieved it. Saleyha, just let me say, I was in the hearing room and you speak for us, you spoke for us. And I'd like to come back to some of the specific things you said in a minute, but I want to talk to Martina as well. Again, the two of you, I have to say, just broke us in the room with your emotion. And Martina, you're the group lead for Northern Ireland COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. I want to hear what your experience was like preparing for it and doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Saleyha said, it was a really important day, and I think I actually said during my evidence that it was a privilege to be there, but what I should have said was it was a sad privilege to be there, because it's not really something that you want to be part of. I never thought that I would be having to give evidence, because of what happened during the pandemic, but it's been very emotional for me. It's been emotional for family and all of the bereaved families. When we sit and we reflect, something that probably government hasn't done, and they really, really should, because if they don't sit and reflect, we're never going to learn a lesson. We are doomed to repeat what happened during the pandemic. This is what, almost 4 years on now. So when we reflect on what happened to us, when we reflect on what happened to our loved ones, people were so compliant. I mentioned during my evidence that I remember speaking to the former Human Rights Commissioner, because I was totally at my wit's end the first day of lockdown. And I really, when I spoke to Les Allenby, I was trying to find a gap in the legislation, because my mummy's care home was a private care home, and obviously the human rights, it's about public authorities and things like that. But didn't really realise at the time, well, they're publicly funded, so they are essentially like a public authority. And a lot of people don't know that, don't realise that. And I seen during the pandemic that total power imbalance between private authorities who are publicly funded and the Department of Health. But I understood very quickly in the first couple of days of the pandemic, after speaking with the former Human Rights Commissioner, that we are in a public health crisis. It's not something that I ever experienced during my lifetime, and it was something that I was going to have to accept. Because honestly, the first couple of hours, I just couldn't. I couldn't accept the fact that I was going to be separated from my mummy. But I did. But then as weeks and months, went by, it was just wrong. When my mummy had her first experience in hospital, and, you'll all be able to, resonate with what I'm saying, for dementia patients, it was really, really difficult. It's difficult for everybody, but when my mummy went into hospital and I seen that we had, and I'm only speaking from my experience, Saleyha, is speaking from a different place as well, being a doctor. But, I realised in the hospital at that time, that first summer, that July 2020, that, okay, we can manage this, because my mummy was tested, I was tested, and we did have some critical tools, infection prevention control. We did have PPE in the hospital at that stage. This is July, this is about 15 weeks into the pandemic. But then for my mummy to return, when she was discharged back into the care home, and she tested negative after about 2 weeks in the hospital, I knew that, well, we can manage this. We have to manage this. But being locked out of a care home for 9 months, enforced separation, it was really difficult. It was really hard to live with that. So people were compliant and, malleable. And then for government, to discover what government did, you know, parties, it's just, it's unbelievable. You know, it really is. It's been a horrendous time for families. And so many families feel, which is something I didn't get to talk about, and I want to mention it just very briefly. You know, you're there representing all of your group. People have very different feelings about different things, and their loved ones passed away at different times during the pandemic. Some people feel that, you know, their loved ones were euthanized. That's a feeling that's going to live with them for the rest of their lives. You know, but maybe we'll get to talk about, you know, the use of midazolam and morphine on a different podcast, but that does need and require a discussion, you know, and obviously the use of DNRs and how they have been inappropriately placed on people. You know, so yeah, and I was very mindful when I was given evidence that, you know, while I got onto the COVID ward, but you've got to put that into perspective. This is 9 months of being locked out of a care home. And like I said, during given evidence, I'm not a violent person. I really wanted to break my mummy's window, but I didn't want to prejudice, you know, a human rights legal challenge that I took after seeing my mother in July 2020. And that's a discussion for another day whenever we come to the care home sector. But yeah, it's been a tough journey, you know, for us all. And I hope that I didn't trigger too much for many people when I was given evidence, because I was very mindful, you know, that people can get easily distressed. And as I said, I'm one of 6 children. While I got to be with my mummy, you know, in her dying hours, you know, the rest of our family didn't. And they were saying goodbye through an iPad, you know, or FaceTime. So yeah, it's been a difficult.
I think people were, of course, they reacted emotionally because the things that you said, Martina, resonated with us. One thing you said in the room when I was there that was particularly interesting to me, and this has to do with how things have not improved. When you talked about your mother having dementia, my husband had young onset dementia and was in a care home and died in a care home. You said the staff lacked training and understanding of dementia. And this really resonated with me because I've found that because previously my husband had cancer and was in hospital, and the staff did not know, and this is a major London hospital, they did not know how to deal with people with dementia. You talked about the butterfly scheme, where they would put a butterfly over the bed. We had it with a forget-me-not in London. And I thought, putting a sign over but it didn't matter. They still put his pills on, that he had no concept what a pill was to take by himself. I think you said something similar. Your mother was on liquid medicine. And my husband was in that situation. That was 2009. And staff still are not trained up to deal with people with dementia. And it broke my heart. If I have to consider myself fortunate that my husband died in March of 2020, we were only separated for 6 days. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be separated from your loved ones who had dementia for so many months. And I think this is one of the cruelest things of this pandemic, that people with dementia, learning difficulties, any kind of vulnerability like that, were separated from the people who know them, who know how to care for them. And I'm so sorry, because that was unbelievably cruel.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, like I think I mentioned and used the words, you know, dementia patients really rely on, you know, tactile sensory therapy, because, you know, they're nonverbal, they can't speak. My mummy recognized my voice, even whether it was, you know, with a mask on or a mask off. But yeah, none of that was taken into consideration, none of it. And that was something, you know, that I wrote to the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, within the first week. I gave a list of those authorities that I contacted, and that was just the first week of the pandemic. So when I said, that I was at my wit's end. I really was. What made me think, really, that Boris Johnson was going to respond? But that's how desperate I was. And I was asking those authorities, could they put special circumstances or arrangements in? Because you have a cohort here of people with dementia that don't understand, instruction. They're not going to understand what is going on. And familiarity, everybody knows, that familiarity and consistency is really, really important for people who have got dementia, whether it's vascular dementia, it's Alzheimer's, whatever falls under that umbrella term. Nobody listened. No, you're shouting from the rooftops.
I know.
From day one, I still cannot understand 9 months into a pandemic that I did not get into my mummy. Even when I met the health minister for Northern Ireland, 6 weeks into a pandemic, he can't say my advisors didn't tell me, because he heard firsthand from me and 5 other families that were all going through the same thing. There really should be criminal sanctions, for lots of different reasons. I know we're not going to get that, but there really should be. And
I know.
Lady Hallett should be using her full powers, because at the end of my evidence, she mentioned something, and I haven't listened to it back yet, but she mentioned something like, we need groups like you. I really should have said, we need you to use your full powers. She has more power than a group probably of bereaved, families, surely. But
I could come to Nicola can maybe tell us about that in a minute. I first wanted to say thank you for sharing all that, Martina. I want to come back to Saleyha. There was another moment similar to Martina when you were talking about your mother and this inability for loved ones to be there. And it isn't just people with dementia or a learning disability, because Saleyha, one of the most powerful moments was when you were able to be with your father and you talked about how he was struggling to breathe and how you thought, what if I hadn't been here? And that was in the room. That was incredibly powerful. And I wonder if you wanted to talk more about that.
Yeah, and I think that time, and that was before we had decided on the end of life pathway, where the plan is then to make the patient comfortable, but that means them not suffering in that way, fighting for breath. And I think when you are faced with them, when you are faced with a human being thrashing, trying to breathe, it's horrendous. And that's, I know there is a discussion, as Martina says, about the use of drugs that we use quite, it's part of the guidelines that we use in the end of life pathway. It's done because that is, it's very difficult, but trying to speak about this as a clinician who knows the pathways, who sees people who don't have that, and how horrendous it is for the actual human being that's struggling to breathe in that way. And it's a very human instinct, whether you're related to that person or whether you're there caring for them as their healthcare worker. You don't want anyone to suffer that. But again, a discussion, people need to be able to talk about it, about what happened to them, what happened to their loved ones. But I was with my father before we went down that route. Believe me, I wish we'd started it earlier, because I didn't want him to be screaming out to be able to breathe, because he slipped down the bed slightly, and then me trying to lift him up myself, you know, with every single ounce of strength I had to lift him up the bed so that he could breathe. I will live with that forever, that we did not, for our own pursuit of trying to save him, we didn't let him have the medication that would have stopped him from having that horror. But you know, that comes from years and years of working as a medic myself and seeing that with other patients. And, you know, what I saw with my father, I saw with other patients. But when it's someone you know and you've known them strong, you know, the person that sort of looked after you, all of that, and then to see them brought to this, it was horrendous. But I think I can appreciate that. And I just really felt for the fact that so many others didn't have a chance to be with their loved one at that time, to give that care, to give, you know, I felt fortunate I was there. And I went in, I shut the door behind me, and I was in the room for 6 days in the same PPE. And I never left, and until we took our father out at the end. But I think just those moments, it's on replay. Remembering how horrendous it was for him is on replay. But I know that, you know, so many others would have given anything to be in their room with their loved ones as well. And my heart goes out to them. It really does. And I know that if I hadn't been there, there would have been, he would have been having that experience on his own.
I think all of us have those moments where we, till the end of our lives, we're going to be replaying these scenes. Martina, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, Saleyha made a very good point, you know, and even from a doctor's perspective, you know, she mentioned about having that discussion, having that debate, and that's really important. But our government and people involved, I'm not speaking about Saleyha at all, you know, that hasn't happened, and that needs to happen, you know, because we talk often about public accountability, you know, and part of that for some families, I'm not saying it's for all, is having that debate, you know, finding out, was there abuse of power? You know, being able to ask those questions, just as a member of the public as well. You know, we're all core participants, we have a legal role, but there are certain things, our hands are tied, and it shouldn't be like that.
I wonder if I could come to Nicola on this, because can you explain to us a little bit about the actual powers of the inquiry and the things that, the very good points that both Martina and Saleyha are making?
Sure. So the powers of an inquiry are limited in that it is set up by the government. The government sets the parameters of it, the terms of reference. So for anyone who is angry that the inquiry isn't looking into something specific, I'm afraid that was set up by the government. They determine what the limits of its investigations are. During the inquiry, the chair has wide-ranging powers in terms of compelling witnesses both to come to the hearing to give evidence, but also to compel organisations or individuals to provide the inquiry with material. In terms of its powers of what it can actually do, the chair is empowered to make recommendations. Unfortunately, the problem with inquiries in general, not just this one, is once those recommendations are made, there is very little that can be done to enforce them. So during the Manchester Arena inquiry, the chair did something quite unusual, which was he wouldn't end the inquiry until he had called witnesses back to give evidence to say, you made this inquiry, you made this recommendation, and this is what we've done. And it was really important that he did that, because what was very clear was that when people came to give evidence, when they talked about the things they had done, those things had only happened in the last 2 or 3 months. And it was the act of coming to give evidence and being held accountable that had prompted any work at all. So without that oversight, without someone breathing down their necks of all these organisations saying, you need to now come to court to account for what you've done, our fear is that these recommendations will sit in a big fat report on a shelf and gather dust. And that's why us and many other organisations have for many years been calling for what's called a national oversight mechanism. So it's a body that would look at all the recommendations that are made and actually hold organisations to account for what they have or haven't done in response to those recommendations. And that's something we've been calling for many years.
Again, the two of you, Saleyha and Martina, your testimony was so powerful, and you said a lot in the limits of time you were given. I wonder if there was anything you wanted to say that you didn't get to say, Saleyha.
One of the recommendations that in that moment, I totally forgot. My brain just went, in the end, when I was asked by the KC, what can we do? What's the next steps? There were some practical things that I just didn't get because we were caught in the headlights. But one of the things we talked about was the impact on healthcare workers who are vulnerable, who were immunocompromised for various existing health conditions, who had the double whammy of having to risk their lives by going to work with poor PPE, or not being able to go to work because it was too dangerous for them within hospitals, and then losing their source of income, losing their years of progression. There have been significant numbers of healthcare workers whose careers and training going forward has been impacted, and they're almost forgotten. They found themselves in a career in a job that they actually couldn't do the job, because if they went to work, the chances are it could have killed them. But there's been absolutely no real mention of them. It's like a forgotten cohort. So one of my recommendations would clearly be, can we pay a bit of attention to this group? I know healthcare workers who have suffered horrendous health conditions, lost their careers, lost their livelihoods, but without any contingency, any compensation, or any even recognition that they exist. And one of my pleas would be that they are remembered in this.
Thanks, Saleyha. Martina.
The one thing that I didn't get to say that I really wanted to say was just how some bereaved families still remain very, very angry. And the reason for that is, there's a number of reasons, but there are some people in our group that feel that way because they feel their loved ones were euthanized, and that this comes back to this conversation, which is so important around certain drugs being used, midazolam specifically, and morphine, because some of us are aware of the Liverpool pathway, and that was dubbed back in its day. It received, a lot of criticism, and it was dubbed, I think, the pathway to euthanasia. And that families are, feeling that, and we need a public debate around this. We need this investigated. And we believe that Lady Hallett has the power to investigate this for some of the bereaved families. And that's right across the board. So yeah, that was the one thing that I wanted to say that I didn't get an opportunity to say. You know,
I think the one thing you did say, and I know there are many bereaved who agree with you, but one thing you did say, Martina, that I remembered was you stressed to the doctor when the DNR was put on, you stressed that it should, and that was simply for CPR, you stressed that it should not be cessation of treatment or lack of, I don't know the terms that they used, it like accelerating the treatment. I remember that very clearly. You said that in your testimony.
yeah, because I felt, you know, with my mummy's age, you know, and a lot of people in Northern Ireland who've been following the inquiry, you know, will know that my mummy was elderly and she was in her 80s. But that shouldn't matter. Because you see, when I look at my mother and my situation, it's a mother and a daughter relationship. It doesn't matter what age they are. You know, and like all of the grief and the trauma that many of the bereaved in all of the groups, you know, are experiencing, it has come from a good place. And I never thought I would say that about grief and trauma. Because why I'm saying that is we all love the people that we lost. And we certainly don't want this to happen to somebody else again. You know, I know a lot of people, and some people do say to me to this day, Martina, why do you bother? You know, this inquiry, it costs too much money. You know, it's not going to go anywhere. What are you expecting out of this? Well, one, you can't put a cost in somebody's life. Two, some people won't get this. You all get it. Because we've all been in similar situations. Unless you've walked this walk, you won't get this until something like this, and I hope to God this never happens and it never darkens their door. You know, and I said something at the very end about democracy. And I've only realised this in the last couple of years, probably because of my experience during this pandemic. Democracy is everybody's responsibility. There are some people out there that are going to sit in the fence. And like I said, if you haven't walked the walk, you won't understand this. And it's so important that the public get behind bereaved families, because it could be you next time.
This is the thing I think people don't understand. And you know, you're a tiger, you're a fighter. I really appreciate that, and I'm so grateful to you and Saleyha. I'm so grateful you both came to talk to us today about your testimony. And then we had 2 days of closing submissions. I have to say, for our group, we had Alison Monroe. I thought she was magnificent. I know you, Nicola, that you all have a hand in this. I thought it was well written, well presented. And I'm saying this, I was glad to see Matt Hancock get such a special mention. I just wonder if you could take us through the closing submissions a little bit, Nicola, and what stood out and the general mood and theme.
Sure. So there were 27 closing submissions. So I'm obviously not going to go through all of them, otherwise I'd be here for another 2.5 days. But some of them were so powerful. Some of them were so disappointing. And I'm sure you can imagine which ones were on the side of the aisle. So the state agencies were all, we did our best, nothing to see here. We were never overwhelmed. The Department of Health for Northern Ireland was just absolutely astounding. I'm sure Martina will want to comment on this. Essentially saying that the lead of the Public Health Agency, his evidence was confusing, but really, should they expect him to know what was going on since he's only been in position for 4 years? 4 years. and he doesn't know what his own department is up to. The Welsh government said when it comes to making recommendations, their view is less is more. Well, of course, because if there's no recommendation, then there's nothing to measure their failures against. Scottish government, again, just said that the system was only tested, wasn't quite overwhelmed. Yeah, really quite disappointing on that side of the aisle. But then really when you come over to the people who matter, I thought the closing submission from the BMA was one of the best I've ever heard. Just really, really set out just what healthcare workers were up against. Really how they were gaslit into being told that that mask that we all know isn't suitable PPE, because even the health and safety executives say it's not PPE, that mask will keep you safe. And the kind of post-event justification as to why they couldn't recommend FFP3s is because there haven't been enough research studies. Well, if that's the case, why were they recommended in aerosol generating procedures? That was the question the BMA posed, and I don't think anyone can answer that. There were 2 closing submissions from pharmaceutical organisations, and really this module has shone a light on the role they played during the pandemic and just how little they were considered. Despite being frontline healthcare workers, they were treated as retail. And that's not to do a disservice to retail. It's really just saying that they were encountering the most sick people who inevitably had COVID and were asking for help. They were going to pharmacists because they couldn't go to their GPs. Brenda Campbell, KC, made the closing on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved. And you mentioned earlier how at the end of Martina's evidence, the chair said, really, we need groups like your group to campaign. And Brenda picked up on this because it was really quite an astounding thing. So Brenda said, you observed at the end of Miss Ferguson's evidence yesterday that the only way that your recommendations get implemented is if groups like the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved families keep the pressure up. That is undoubtedly true, but it's undeniably sad. It should not be for the bereaved or the disabled or migrant workers to continue to fight to force change. And that really, really, really says it all, that the chair has all this power to make recommendations, yet she's calling on the bereaved to continue to fight. They've done enough fighting throughout their grief to then be asked to fight yet more. That was quite a moment. The Trade Union Congress pointed out how both Matt Hancock and Sajid Javid both said that when it comes to protecting healthcare workers who were at greater risk, their approach was not to treat anyone any differently. They both talked about being colorblind, completely ignoring the fact that if you treat everyone the same, that doesn't mean you treat everyone equally. There are certain groups who need an extra step, who need an extra measure to keep them protected. They're not asking for special treatment, they're asking for equal treatment, but that doesn't mean the same treatment. And that just seems to have completely passed Matt Hancock and Sajid Javid by. One thing that really stood out, the John's campaign, they said really very simply but very powerfully, and I think many people need to be reminded of this: the NHS is for all. No group is unworthy of treatment because, for example, of their age, disability, care needs, or place of residence. All lives are of equal value, and health policies and practices must reflect that. And I think above all things throughout the pandemic, that was lost.
Martina, Nicola just referenced you there that you might have some thoughts about the closing submissions regarding Northern Ireland.
Yeah, Brenda Campbell, our lawyer, our KC, she, I thought, was very, very powerful. You know, she really hit home. She was brilliant. She mentioned just in general about the issues that were too long to mention, the systemic issues. She explained, you know, to Baroness Hallett how our, you know, deceased, our loved ones held a special place for us, that we need change and we need it soon. The next day, which was after I gave evidence, we were still in London, and some of the families attended the hearing. And I think the KC was called Nessa Murnahan, and she was the representative for the Department of Health. So I actually walked out during that closing submission. I couldn't listen to it anymore, because despite me and other families flagging very key issues to the Department of Health and asking them to reflect, to put in place, you know, measures to improve the experience, you know, of other families, they took that opportunity to paint a rosier picture. And I personally felt that that's wrong. We are telling you that you did not listen to us from the very beginning of this pandemic. So if they're not going to reflect, as I said earlier, they're not going to learn anything. And if we are faced with another pandemic, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes that have already been made in the last one.
I agree with every point you make, and I just find it incredibly moving that, as Nicola just said, that Lady Hallett calls on the bereaved to continue to fight when they shouldn't have to, and yet they're willing to. And I just am full of admiration, Martina. And I'm so grateful to you and Saleyha for coming on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorelei. Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you, Lorelei and Nicola and Martina, for you know, sharing this morning with me, and for inviting me to speak. It means a huge amount. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martina. Thank you, Saleyha. It's been wonderful to have you on today. I know it's important that you give evidence, but I think in the stress of it all, there's inevitably issues that you wish you'd said. And I'm glad that coming on today has given you both that opportunity to mention things that you missed in evidence. So thank you both for coming on. Thank you for sharing your stories. I know it's not easy to go back to those places, but it is very important and it is certainly appreciated. So thank you both. And thank you to you, Lorelei, for this 10-week stretch of this podcast. This actually brings us to the end of the Module 3 hearings and therefore the Module 3 podcast. But thank you so much for doing this to help our clients to follow the proceedings and stay up to date with it. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.